Some of my favorite soulful music of all time actually comes from old school 70s Blaxploitation films, which also means that it's some of my favorite music to try to recreate. So today, I'm gonna show you how to make your own samples to recreate that sound. So for this sample, I started off with the Rhodes, which, believe it or not, is probably the only complicated instrument in terms of playing. And for this, I used the Lounge Lizard EP4, and here's what it sounds like. So like I said, in terms of playing the instruments, this is probably the only complicated instrument that I have. And as you can see here in the MIDI, I'm not playing all of the notes perfectly quantized, which is gonna be a theme that you're gonna notice throughout this whole sample breakdown, which is you're gonna wanna play all of your instruments the way that they were intended to be played. So as far as effects are concerned, I really only have an EQ where I'm cutting out the low end. Then I'm routing my Rhodes over to another channel, which is basically a send for my reverb. Next up, I'm gonna show you the strings for this sample, which is made up of 3 different types of string sections. The first one is the simplest, and it's basically just a string ensemble that I have from Contact. It's from their String Ensemble Symphony series. So let me show you what that sounds like. I'm only playing one note, but it sounds really dramatic because the dynamics of the strings are going up and down. And the way that I got them to do that is by just using automation, which is another really big pro tip for how you can make your VST instruments sound more realistic. You're gonna wanna use automation. So as you can see here, I'm using the modulation automation in order to get the strings to go from soft to more loud. And this is something that you can do in just about any professional DAW. It's not just something that you can do in Logic. Or if you have a MIDI keyboard and you wanna test out just about any VST instrument, just play with the mod wheel and you're gonna see that a lot of the sounds that you have actually have way more dynamics and way more to them than you might have actually known before. So the next type of string sounds that I have for the string section is these classic 70s soul disco sounding string falls. And for this sample, I'm using Session Strings by Native Instruments. And then last for the strings, I have these legato strings from LA Scoring Strings, and I'm basically playing them at 2 different octaves and really light in order to get them to have that glissando sound. So here's what that sounds like. And for all of the strings in the string section, I have them being sent to the same reverb that the Rhodes are going to. Next up, I have this orchestral oboe, and basically all I have that doing is backing up the violins. And then as you can see here, I'm basically doing some modulation to do the same thing that I did with the strings, which is make them a little bit more dynamic with the mod wheel in order to make them go from soft to more loud. The next instrument that I added was some bass, and for that I used the Scarby J bass. And as you can see here, I'm not really going all that crazy with the MIDI. I really added it to make the sample sound like a cinematic soul sample rather than just cinematic. Next up, I added some piano. As you can see here, I'm not really doing too much. I'm just playing 2 notes really low. And I really just wanted the piano to be felt more than heard. So for this sample, I used Addictive Keys, and here's what it sounds like. I told you, in terms of playing, most of this is really just gonna be simple. Next up, I added some 70s rock guitar, and it's basically doing 2 things. 1, it's backing up the piano, and then 2, it's also adding some ambiance. And for the guitar sound, I did use Sample Tank 2, but unfortunately, since I've updated my system, it no longer works on my computer, so thankfully, I thought ahead and actually bounced the guitar. So we do have the audio here. And in terms of processing, I really didn't do much other than EQ. And now we're in the home stretch. The last thing that I added to the sample was the drums. If I'm being honest, I kind of just have them there as like a rhythm section, again, to make it sound more like a cinematic soulful sample rather than just a cinematic sample. Now, as far as the kick is concerned, I'm using Addictive Drums and I'm using the Fairfax kit. Now, in terms of processing, some of you guys are gonna go crazy, but I'm using the RVox to actually gate out some of the reverb that's in the kick sample. So here's what it sounds like without, and here's what it sounds like with it. As you can see, it basically takes off all of the room sound from the kick. Next up, I'm using a hi-hat, which is also from the Fairfax kit and Addictive Drums. And I am basically just doing some processing with the SSL EQ. And then last but not least, I'm using a perk from the Damage kit in Contact, which is also made by Native Instruments. And I'm just using this to back up the kick. So once I laid down all of the instruments, first thing that I did was I routed all of the melodic instruments to their own bus channel, and I'm processing them through the Studer A800 from UAD, and it's basically just adding some saturation. And then for the drums, I kind of wanted them to sound a little bit older. So what I did was I routed them to their own bus channel using the Waves J37, and I'm just using the Abbey Rhodes default. Next up, I have the RC20. I'm using the Vinyl 2 preset, but I've kind of tweaked the effects down here. And then I'm using this SSL compressor to kind of glue all of the sounds together. Without, with it. And then finally, once you put everything together, here's what it all sounds like. So that's a look into my process for making authentic sounding 70s soulful Blaxploitation composition. If you want to use that sample, I left the link in the description. And if you want to get 10 royalty-free samples from me for free, I left the link in the description for that too. And last, if you like this video but you want to get more tips on how to make your own original soul samples, check out this video right here.